spiders caught in her web alongside the flies like us, the portly co-pilot observed sagely. They've been weaving their own little traps within the greater trap for decades, building petty fiefdoms in hell. For instance, take this Admiral Kajaran, the sea spider we call him. Keeping his eye on the control panel, Jamie Yardo frowned. Ortega was still gabbing away to the crazed guard officer, as if they were old comrades, reunited against the lost gulf of years, waxing lyrically about his conspiracy theories and picking holes in their sacred crusade. With mounting fury, Giardo touched the silver icon on his lapel, praying for guidance. The shuttle was coasting through a relatively clean pocket of air right now, and the turbulence had died down. When the Emperor's grace, the ship's machine spirit, would be trusted to coast along untended for a minute or so. If Giardo moved swiftly. Disease, did you say? The colonel was asking. So the rumors go, Ortega paused for effect. Naturally, the Admiral keeps himself locked away in the high towers of his cursed warship, hiding away like one of those blood-sucking monsters from old myths. Nobody's actually seen the man in years, save for his priests. And they're a grim crowd. The Lethan Penance, they call themselves. I tell you, senor, those bastards will crucify you as soon as look at you. Would I be right in thinking you're not a devout man, Ortega? Cutler asked. On the contrary, senor, I would cast my soul into the warp sea for the God Emperor, Ortega protested. But these penitents are a perversion of the imperial creed. They made a virtue of malice, a sanctity of suffering. And what about the Sky Marshal? Cutler cut to the man's increasingly purple rhetoric. Seems to me he's sleeping on the job, up there in orbit. Sky Marshal Sebastian Kitcher is a hero of the Imperium, Yardo snarled, spinning to face them. There was a stubby service pistol in his hand. Cutler dived aside as the youth fired. A round whipped past his face, and another tore into the shoulder of his jacket. But the third was completely off. As the bullets ricocheted wildly around the confines, the cold professional part of the colonel's mind observed Giardo was an appalling shot. Then Cutler was on his knees, leveling his own pistol, but Ortega was already on top of the young pilot, wrestling for the weapon like an angry old bear. Giardo was spitting and snarling furiously, weapon in hand like an old bear. His muscles weren't too much to speak of, and he couldn't shift Ortega's bulk. The co-pilot smacked the youth's trigger hand against the control panel, smashing against the sharp edges until the gun slipped free. As Giardo howled in pain, Ortega headbutted him full in the face. Once, twice. After a third crack, the youth slumped senselessly into his chair. The burst of strength drained out of the co-pilot and slumped against the helm, breathing hard. His sweaty face was spattered with blood from his comrade's pulverized nose. Slowly at first, then with increasing violence, the ship began to shake. Ortega, Cutler growled. The Vizanti threw a dazed look at the shuttle, watched as it groaned, and the cockpit canted sharply downward. Ortega swore and crushed down into his seat. His hands darted over the controls like birds of prey as he struggled to rein in the vessel's neglected machine spirit. Padre de Imperios, Ortega breathed as the turbulence finally subsided and the whole world steadied around them. His eyes were fixed rigidly ahead. You still with me, flyboy? Cutler asked. That was a very long time coming, Ortega said through harsh grasps. Feels good, doesn't it? And what exactly am I feeling so good about? Cutler stared at him for a long moment, suddenly unsure of himself. Then he sighed, dredging up a soul-deep weariness. He made him seem much older than Ortega. Instead of answering, he hauled the unconscious pilot to the floor and sank into his place, gazing into the nebulous fog swirling past the windows and seeing nothing. Ortega lost himself in the old trusted task of steering the ship while he waited for an answer. His rasping breaths had been slowed by time.
You okay?
Tell me, Ortega, would you have the balls to fly this tug into a hot zone? I might say that I could do it with my eyes closed and my hands bound, but that would manifest an exaggeration. I guess I'm going to take that as a yes, which is just as well, because we won't be stopping off the Spider Admiral's boat. I'm not sure I follow you, senor. Does a place called De La Rosa Beach mean anything to you? Cutler watched him with bright, angry eyes. Nothing that I like, Ortega said carefully. Well, that makes the two of us. Cutler nodded. But I'm not asking you to like it. I'm just asking you to take me there. Keeping his eyes on their guide, Captain Templeton slashed a path through another snarl of creepers with the saber and swatted hopelessly at the swarming flies. The vermin had hit Arkin in a furious, biting wall the moment they had entered the jungle, then harried them every step of the way, like tiny winged demons. Nothing seemed to deter them, and some of the men had already given up the fight. But their sly bites made the captain's skin crawl, and he kept slapping them stubbornly. The Phaedron veterans probably had some kind of repellent for the vermin, but if so, they hadn't offered it to the newcomers. They hadn't offered much of anything, except a rapid passage into the hells. There had been little respite at the ramshackle base called De La Rosa Breach. Templeton's company had been met by a patrol of slovenly sentries, and waved onto the tree line, where a craggy-faced officer had been overseeing the new arrivals. The crew-cut ogre had ridiculed their tardy landing and dandy uniforms, gloated that they wouldn't last a day in the mire, but he'd soon grow bored, almost as if the newcomers weren't worthy of his wit. Without bothering to ask his name or rank, the brute launched into a mission profile that was so thin on detail it would snap from a sharp glance. In short, there was no long. Their orders were to reinforce a push on an ancient temple complex, some took 3 kilometers inland, designated the Shell. The necropolis was thought to serve as the primary rebel base for the region. The attack had begun 3 days ago, and there were at least 2 other Imperial forces involved, but the composition, disposition, and current status of those forces was unknown. Intelligence on the enemy seemed equally threadbare to Templeton. They would be facing a small contingent of Tau, probably a few Xenos mercenaries, and a whole heap of fish. Fish? Templeton had asked, trying to ignore the furious itching in his left hand where the scabs had bitten him. Yes, fish. The indigenous scum. The officer pointed to a band of gangly figures in gray jumpsuits, slouched by the perimeter. Templeton had assumed they were simply bedraggled guardsmen, but that mistake hadn't stood up to closer scrutiny. The Phaedrons, or Salatha as Cutler called them in his briefing, were clearly of human stock, but their degeneracy was obvious. There was nothing overtly wrong about them, but nothing that was quite right either. They were at least a head shorter than an average man, but their stature was further diminished by their spindly bow legs and hunched posture. Their heads were uniformly broad, flat and brutish, with widely spaced goggle eyes and flat rubbery lips. Fish, you see it, right? The officer grinned, and Templeton had reluctantly agreed that yes, he did in fact see it, that the degeneracy had unsettled him deeply. Is the human bloodline so really open to corruption? Templeton wondered. And if so, might our entire race not sink back into the primordial slime with the passing of ignorant eons? Webbed fingers, too, the brutish officer continued. Personally, I'd cleanse the lot of them, but apparently they just about pass for human. Well, they're ugly scum, but they've got their uses. The ones who didn't rebel are almost pitifully loyal, probably because they know the rest will skin 'em alive if we lose the war. And they make damn fine guides. He pointed the gang by the trees. These boys call themselves Ascari. I guess that means scout in fish speak. After 3 hours trekking through the mire, Templeton had come to share the officer's faith and the Ascari's jungle craft. The native assigned to his platoon had led them through the jungle with swift, knowing steps, steering them around impenetrable clusters of vegetation and creeper-infested fissures. They were traveling a clotted, broken land that conjoined up visions of vast, weed-choked regicide board, where the light and dark squares corresponded to vitality and decay. Aware that one misstep in this tangled disharmony of life and death could prove fatal, the captain found himself growing more grateful for the guide the deeper they went. For all his degeneracy, the native was their lifeline in this maze. Occasionally the Ascari would bring them up to a halt, with a raised hand, and drop to his haunches, sniffing suspiciously at the ground like an animal. Then nod and scurry on. Often we would stop to peer at a glistening fungal tree, or a swarming curtain of creepers, keeping his distance as he searched for some obscure telltale clue. Then he would either hurry past or urge his charges back with sharp gestures. On one occasion, he had fled from something on the path ahead, frantically shooing the platoon away. As he retreated, Templeton caught a glimpse of a titanic, violent bloom, leering at him from the clearing ahead, and shuddering at its gently undulating mantle of tendrils, both fascinated and repelled. He hoped the other platoons would have been gifted equally talented guides. Their force was spread out, advancing through the jungle in a loose wedge of 12 platoons, each numbering around 50 men. The platoons of 2nd Company had taken the center, while those of the 3rd and the 4th had fanned out to either flank. They entered the jungle in a much tighter formation, but the labyrinth of trees had played havoc with that plan, and the teams soon lost sight of each other. Although they maintained box contact, nobody really knew where they were anymore, and Templeton could only pray that they were all going the same direction. The wiry Ascari raised his hand, and the graybacks of Dust Snake and Hawksbill squads crowded up alongside him, peering into the murk. A few paces ahead, the ground dipped sharply, and the jungle dissolved into a mist-wreathed swamp. The water strangled by a tangle of mangrove-like trees. But those weren't the only things choking the swamp. There were bodies everywhere, floating languidly, with their limbs splayed out like broken dolls. Some were riddled with arrows that looked like human pincushions. Others were shockingly charred and sundered, evidently the victims of powerful energy weapons. Although the corpses were crawling with flies and leeches, they were obviously still fresh. "Must be at least a dozen of them down there." Sergeant Calhoun had to raise his voice with the buzzing of the feeding frenzy of the vermin. "Looks like the poor bastards never saw it coming." "The jungle shocks," Lieutenant Sanford said somberly. The tall, square-jawed veteran had been given overall command of the 2 squads, and Calhoun figured that was just fine. Sanford might be an academy boy with a pole rammed up his backside, but he was actually a half-decent soldier. By Willis Calhoun's reckoning, that was a pretty good result for an officer. "Aren't these boys we're meant to be linking up with?" Calhoun asked. "Indeed, but let's not rush into a link with them now, Sergeant," Sanford said with grim humor. He shot a questioning look at their guide, and the Salatha nodded, indicating their path lay beyond the corpse-choked swamp. "Well now, don't the Emperor just love his graybacks today?" Roach muttered, drawing a frown from the lieutenant. It wasn't a question of love, Dust Snake, Satifer said. Then he spotted the scout's tassels, hanging from Roach's cap, and smiled. Care to take point with our swampy friends, Scout? And here I was thinking you'd never ask, Lieutenant. Roach tipped his cap and grinned sourly at the scary guide. You and me, we're gonna make a fine team, Mr. Fish. To his surprise, the native grinned right back at him. Do you smell that? Valance asked. The black-bearded scout had stopped, sniffing suspiciously at the smog rising from the marshland. Machin couldn't tell anything through his sealed helmet, and he trusted the ex-trapper's instincts. Usually for a scout, Yox Valance was a short-barreled, chested bear of a man, but he could never move as silently as the northern tracker. Rumor had it he'd learned his craft smuggling skins past the feral orc tribes. What have you got, Scout? The captain growled, scanning the skeletal trees for a target. The damnable mist was flittering everywhere. I don't know, Captain, but it's something new. Valance was frowning as he tried to make sense of the odor. It smells like milk that's turned sour, and something else. Something sharp. Maybe blackroot, or... We've lost the fish! Someone shouted from up ahead. Prentice, Wade, with me! Machin called to the intravox suit. He tore his iron boots free of the clinging sludge and clanked towards the unseen speaker, with his brother's wolves on either flank. For the last hour or so, his platoon had been up to their ankles in mud, and over their heads in smog. The stuff rose from the ground in thick streamers, transforming the vegetation to a ghostly graveyard parody of the jungle. Everything looked withered and desiccated here. Even by the standard of this ice-white planet, this region is ugly, Machin reflected gloomily. Hale and Backman are gone too. There was an edge of panic in the point man's voice as the Zouaves marched up alongside him, with Valance at their heels. There they were a moment ago, the grayback pointed ahead. Just past those trees. Machin signaled to Valance, and the scout advanced cautiously. He stopped by the suspected cluster of trees, his sharp eyes picking out a residue of black slime splattered across the chunks. Gingerly, he sniffed the stuff and gagged at the stench. Catching a glint of metal, he dropped to his knees and ran his fingers over the bark, wincing as something drew blood. Squinting, he saw the trunk was riddled with a web of tiny razor-sharp metal filaments. I've found... A soft hiss came from the smog ahead, and Valance froze. A moment later, the hiss was followed by a low, wet rattle. The scout rose and backed away, his eyes never straying from the mist ahead. There's something out there, he breathed. Something more than an animal. Form up around me, Greybacks, Machin commanded, like an old fury and stoking up the old fury in his gut like a loyal friend. If the hells were going to break loose, then John Milton Machin was ready to oblige them. Templeton had lost his bearing hours ago, but their guide clearly knew his business, so he immersed himself in the nightmare trek, hoping to embrace the living dead phantasma of the jungle. It offered such a wealth of illusions to a refined spirit, such potential for metaphor and wordplay. Yet, try as he might, the words eluded him, lost in the smog of pain that would slowly seep across his mind. It was the bites, of course, some infection he'd caught from those damnable corpse crabs back on the beach. His left hand had been throbbing for hours now, summoning up a fever that was turning his thoughts to sludge. The captain paused to catch his breath, letting the others march past, as he unwound his makeshift bandage and inspected the wounds. His whole hand had swollen up, and he could see a tracery of purple lines weaving up his wrist. Once again he cursed himself for letting the bites go untended at the outpost, but they'd seemed so trivial back then. Besides, he hadn't wanted to look weak in front of Machin. His fellow captain already had precious little respect for him. Something whirred overhead, and a sonorous buzzing drone. Templeton glanced up and caught a shape flitting between the treetops, dark and jagged against the emerald canopy. It was gone in the blink of an eye, but he was left with the impression of something thorny and misshapen, like a huge insect. The Lord of Flies, chitinous monarch of sickening skies. One hell of a big bug, eh, sir? Sergeant Brennan said, disturbing Templeton's vague inspiration. Brennan was a cheery, pragmatic bruiser, who might have been the captain's polar opposite. Seen now half a dozen of them fly past in the last hour. Don't much like the look of 'em. The mire is full with Xenos filled, yes. Commissar Cadet Rydick interjected as he came alongside them. Much to Templeton's irritation, the youth had fastened onto his squad. Here all the animal and plant is tainted. One day we'll burn them all. But it is not today. Rydick marched past, and Templeton saw the back of his storm coat. It was riddled with bullet holes. The young cadet wasn't the first man to wear the coat, and probably wouldn't be the last. In all likelihood, commissars didn't last very long on Phaedra. Another of the giant insects flitted by overhead, punctuating its flight with a rhythmic melody of twitters and chirps. Its strange song drew a chorus of replies from a dozen unseen companions. Throughout its growing delirium, Templeton felt something nagging at him, something about that song. You all right, sir? Brennan asked, peering at the captain's pallid, glistening face. Just a touch of heat stroke, Sergeant, Templeton said weakly, unsure he was hiding the truth. Best get on. We don't want to fall behind in this maze. As they went deeper into the mire, Templeton found his eye returning to the canopy, watching the treetops for a flash of chitin. I was discharged from the infirmary 2 weeks ago, yet High Commissar Lomax hadn't summoned me. Doubtless she's engaged with more pressing matters than an errant commissar, but sometimes I can't help thinking she's playing games. I have occupied my reprieve by exploring the abandoned lower tiers of this rusting old sea platform, delving through the flooded underchambers as I straighten out my story. Any lie will do, so long as it convinces Lomax of the one truth that matters. I am going to kill Commander Wintertide. Number 27 accompanies me on my wanderings, a mute reminder of Indigo Gorge, where my quest began 9 months and an eternity ago. Indigo Gorge. In 20 years of soldiering across more worlds than I care to recall, I'll never see the likes of that killing ground. We were dying in droves, wading upriver through the red corpse paste of our fallen, as flickering lances of the blueskins sliced down from the escarpments high above. They had the cover, the range, and the elevation. What good was faith against that? And what possible purpose did my 27th execution serve? And what possible purpose did my 27th execution serve? If that murder had somehow turned the rout, well, what then? Another 1,000 lost, maybe more. And yet we'd have been no closer to victory. But Neiman's shade was with me that day, filling my heart with ice. So when the charge faltered and my charges fled, I didn't hesitate to take the shot. There was no calculation in my choice. The sacrifice was just another fleeing shape amongst many, a coward, expendable. If I still believe I hadn't seen her eyes. But as she fell, she rolled over and I caught her gaze. Her features were made strange by the distorting waters, stranger still by the perfect geometry of the third eye my bullet had punched through her skull. She couldn't have been more than 18, a plain girl, already haggard with the rigors of life in the guard. But as she slipped into the water and out of life, she looked right at me, and I caught the last flicker of something that I could call holy. And so number 27 became the third member of my shadow triumvirate. And while Bierce and Neiman despise me, her gaze burns with a terrible pity, which is so much worse. It is for her that I will kill Wintertide and end this meat grinder war. Iverson's journal. The men of Dust Snake were wading waist deep in the curdled soup of the swamp, their rifles over their heads to keep out the muck, and their mouths shut to keep out the flies. Together with Hawksbill Greybacks, they followed their guide to the morass with silent determination, all except Boone. The burly Badlander was cussing and splashing about, angrily chewing up the insects as he tried to dislodge the razor-toothed thing that had latched onto his boot. Toomey was still slung across his shoulders, a dead weight that sometimes burbled and groaned, but showed no sign of recovery. A couple of the others had offered to take a stint carrying him, but Boone had refused. The sniper had always been good to him, never calling him a groxbrain, and never letting him with a few hands of the cars now and again. Sergeant Calhoun had wanted to leave the injured man behind at the outpost, but Boone hadn't liked the looks of the place, and evidently the old bullethead had backed off. The big man had it all worked out. Even if Toomey didn't get better, it would be fine, because Boone probably wouldn't be the dumbest grayback in the squad anymore. This was probably the deepest insight of his life, and it made him intensely happy. Despite the heat and the flies, he'd carried his burden with a big smile, sure that life was finally on the up. And then the eel thing had started biting his boots. It spoiled the last few minutes of Gordy Boone's vague life. When the end came, Calhoun was shouting at him to shut the hells up, and Roach was turning to offer a gem of sarcastic wisdom. And then something slapped Boone right in the eye. For a moment, he was angry. Then he was hurt. Then he wasn't anything anymore except a slab of dead meat toppling to the water. Toomey splashed down beside him, groaning reflexively at the shock. Roach grinned, thinking the big groxbane had slipped. But then he saw the black spine sticking out of Boone's eye and sank below the water scum. Something whickered past Roach's ear, and Hawksbill Grayback gurgled, clutching at an arrow sprouting from his throat. And in another heartbeat, the air was alive with the hail of arrows, and men were screaming and falling all around him. Their native guide dived below the water, and Roach followed, screwing his eyes shut against the filth. Above him, the surface popped with impacts, and he felt something scrape his shoulder. Desperately, he forced himself down the silt bed and swam, blindly hunting for cover. "Get into the mangroves!" Calhoun yelled, ignoring the arrow jutting from his shoulder as he surged through the mire towards a clump of trees. Coley and Pope splashed past him, firing wide volleys of las fire at the shadows dancing in their midst. He could see Lieutenant Sandifer leading a gaggle of Hawksbill men to a mound of fallen trees, his saber raised and his pistol flaring, standing heroic, hopeless bursts into the mist. The three men crashed down into cover and found Dix already there, struggling to jam his wiry frame into the cavern of gnarled roots. To Calhoun's disgust, he was whimpering. "They're coming from all sides!" One-eyed Coley snarled, frantically trying to train his las rifle everywhere at once. as the guerrillas tightened their circle. The naked warriors dissolved out of the mist like hunched ghosts, fired their arrows with guttural whoops, and then faded back to reload. "Get in as deep as you can," Calhoun shouted, his eyes hunting for the boy as he snapped the shaft off his shoulder and crawled into the tangle. He heard a sigh of relief as he caught sight of Joyce, crouching in the hollow. This was the Green Cap's first tussle, but he didn't look scared. In fact, there was a big grin on his face that made Calhoun proud and uneasy at the same time. Dick squealed as a huge spider flopped down onto his face from the rotten hollows of the mangrove. It gripped his head like a pair of skeletal hands, all bony legs and hard ridges, and far too many eyes. Calhoun ripped it away and threw it aside. It took Dick's nose with it, leaving a gushing crater in the middle of his face. Swearing in disgust, Calhoun pumped the scabbering spider full of las bolts and turned to the others. "We've got to start dishing paint back at him," Calhoun said, trying to blot out Dick's screaming. "They can't get us under here, but we've got to hold them back." One of the giant insects swooped low, hooked its clawed feet into a man's back, and tore him shrieking from the ground. Surging back to the treetops to let it go, turning his victim to a shrieking, flailing mannequin. Captain Templeton leapt back as the man crashed into the mulch at his feet, broken but still breathing. Blood gurgled from the wreck's ruptured throat as it tried to beg for help, and Templeton fell to his knees, his hands fluttering helplessly over the broken pile as he gasped for words that wouldn't come. Templeton understood. The words wouldn't come from him either. Commissar Cadet Rydick charged past him, leafing frenetically through a battered tactical manual with one hand as he snapped off shots with the other. Somewhere nearby, Sergeant Brennan was shouting, and the Vox operator was screaming into his crackling set, and a steam-blood Zouave had triggered his shoulder speakers, flooding the gale with bombastic music. And men were swearing and fighting and dying all around Ambrose Templeton. The captain shook his head and slapped himself hard in the face, trying to dislodge the clouds in his skull. The attack had come so suddenly. His platoon had just entered a forest glade, and when a battle had flared up somewhere in the distance. In that moment, the insects had surged down from above, almost as if they were obeying a prearranged signal. And damn it all, they were! I knew it was coming all along. I knew they were talking to each other. Yet again, Captain Machin heard the ghost rattle in the mist. Then again, on their left flank, their right flank, from behind. "Wherever it is, there's more than one," Valance whispered. "Let's flush this craven scum out," Whedon said, over the intro suit Vox. His patrician tones were filled with contempt. "Wait, let them come to us," Machin hissed. "They're hungry for it." He had the platoon formed up in a tight phalanx, bristling with las rifles on every front, reinforced with 3 armored Zouaves, and their heavy stubbers at equidistant points. It was a textbook defense that Imogen had favored against feral greenskins and outlanders back home on Providence, but his patience was wearing thin. They could all hear the muffled sounds of distant las fire, and the other platoons engaged with the enemy, winning glory while John Mental Machin just sat there. Suddenly, something cackled and whirled in the fog, like a machine slowly winding up. 2 more machines chugged a life in response. "Sir, might I suggest," Pretis began, but his voice was disintegrated in a screeching cacophony as a storm of metal erupted from the mist, tearing into the phalanx from 3 sides. Sergeant Calhoun grinned as another primeval guerrilla leapt from the mist, right into the sights of his las rifle. Before the Satha could loose his arrow at the sergeant, he was laced through the eye. Cully and Pope wedged between the roots on either side of him, backing him up with short, sharp bursts. But he'd given up on Dix. The injured Badlander was huddled in a fetal ball, whimpering pitifully as he clutched his ruined face. The ambush had cost them nearly half their number, but the survivors were pulling things back. Lieutenant Sandifer had set up a decent firing perimeter, with half a dozen graybacks, targeting the rebels with precise, disciplined volleys. These savages have spirit and cunning, but bows and arrows are no match for arc fire, Calhoun thought fiercely. A bolt of energy streaked through the mist and tore from a tree. What in the hells was that? Pope hissed. That was for us fragged, Cully answered as a second killing bolt sizzled out of the jungle, and Calhoun had to admit he was probably right. Something buzzed behind Templeton. He lurched around and stared blearily into the face of the nightmares. It looked like an insane three-tiered pyramid of compound eyes built on a plinth of mandibles. Long, tapering antennae flared out from either side of the conical head, tilted sharply towards his prey. Despite his peril, Templeton was fascinated by the monstrous warrior, almost hypnotized by the quicksilver blur of its wings. The thing was craggily bipedal, but any resemblance to humanity ended there. Its double-jointed legs ended in massive talons, and its body was a patchwork exoskeleton of hard plates and vicious barbs. Strangest of all, the insect was carrying a gun. As it leveled the weapon, he saw the blur of its wings flitter and oscillate, modulating their rhythm. The crystalline prong and the gun barrel shimmered, resonating in harmony with the droning, almost as if the wing case was calibrating the gun, and Sergeant Brennan bowed into Templeton and threw him aside. Spinning, he sent a volley of lasfire into the insect's face, incinerating 2 tiers of eyes. The creature chittered in pain and pulled away, its wings beating furiously.